my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai, coming at you live with a video with my sake drinking gourd in hand. Now at the moment this is not filled with sake, just water, but still. Gives the illusion and good for cosplay. Not a bad water bottle. You can pick this up for like 40 bucks off of Amazon. Even comes with a stand. But that's not the point here today. The point of this video, if you saw the title, is that after giving it some thought since Gargoyle posted his video about sword belts and sword frogs, I have a few things that I would like to add to the topic. Now, it was originally a response to Shatterversity or Scalagram, one of the two. It's been a minute since I watched the video. But my thing is, I honestly believe that a katana could work good either in your belt or suspended from your hip via a sword frog. Now, there are a few advantages that the sword frog gives you. One is if you are of a more big-bellied swordsman, it puts the sword a little lower down on your hip, and you're not having the tsuba press into the flub of your belly. 2, if you're using a longer blade, it gives you more of an ability to just draw the sword quickly and cut. Because the sword is lower down, it essentially allows you to basically do sayabiki without doing sayabiki, as far as I can tell. Now, obviously, there are some disadvantages to the sword frog thing. One is that the sword is kind of free hanging, meaning that, yes, technically it does kind of flop around, but this can be mitigated simply by resting your hand either on the hilt of the sword, or you just let your hand free rest on the tsuba, and this can mitigate the wobbling around. Now, another large advantage that the sword frog gives you actually comes from sitting. You can kind of see the chair. Now, with the way a regular katana sits on your belly, yes, in these kinds of chairs, you can sit down relatively easily. In fact, if you've ever watched a period drama of the Japanese general or commander of the troops, when they're on the battlefield in their little commander's tent, the exact reason why their chairs are shaped like this is so that they can sit down whilst still wearing their swords. Which, these kinds of chairs are very comfortable. In fact, the modern day director's chair is, as far as I believe, derived from this chair style, just sideways. Now, let's pretend for a moment that we have a chair with arms. So we have good arms right here. naturally you'd have to take the sword out of your belt. And with the sword frog, this can be done actually a little bit easier. Let me explain. Because generally speaking, you have to pull the sword out. And if someone's standing next to you or directly in front of you, and they turn around or don't notice you're pulling the sword out, notice that the sword is going up and straight ahead of you. With a sword frog, this whole process is immediately mitigated simply by removing your belt. You can take the sword off with a much less chance of hitting somebody or something around you. Now, I do hear what you're saying, Outlaw. The chances of me hitting somebody taking the sword out of my belt are extremely low and mitigated. True, but let's not forget that in the Japanese culture, you could have a duel, samurai could have duels started over just simply two swords bumping into each other. And that was a thing. When two samurai would walk down the road and their sires would clash with one another, that basically was like, hey, you disrespected me, I must fight you for my honor. Gen Z in 15th century. But the point I'm trying to make is that while it is extremely mitigated that you're going to hit somebody doing this, the chances are still there. Especially, I could see it as like, you're coming over to an old friend's house, you get, like, if two samurai who've known each other for a long time, they're talking, they're going over to a friend's house, they just pull the bloody thing out of their belt, and they don't notice where the other end is going because they're stuck in conversation. They could crack a vase, rip through the paper walls that adorn the door. Like, it's something that you wouldn't think would happen, but there is still the possibility. That's why the sword frog gives you the advantage of just being able to unclip your belt and take the sword off all at once. And honestly, it's faster to rearm yourself this way as well, because with traditional Japanese clothing, first you have to put on the belt, then you have to put the sword through your belt. With a sword frog, you just pick up sword, belt, and all, and by the time they finish tying the obi, which should take around 60 seconds, I just put this back on in about 5, and I have the rest of those 55 seconds to get my sword out and ready for a duel. There are advantages to the sword frog that give you somewhat, if you think about it more in a military sense. Through a military sense, it gives you a bit more of advantage just being at the ready. Also, before anyone mentions anything, Outlaw, you have the saya oriented the wrong way. Well, that's pretty much because my Warrior O is basically a handachi, which is a tachi without the traditional hanging fittings. So when I use my sword frog, I keep it like this for A, for that reason. B, because when you're doing EI anyways, sometimes you'll turn the sword to the side, and it just eliminates that whole having to turn the sword and reorient the scabbard problem. Not to say that if I wanted to, I couldn't just take the sword out of the frog, turn it around, and boom. But here brings me to the problem of putting a katana in this thing in the traditional manner. And that is you still have to basically draw it the way you would normally draw it when it's in your belt. And that works fine and everything when it's at waist level or near waist level, but this is at hip level. And your waist is actually above your hip bones, in between your ribs and the top of your hip bone. When the sword is on your hip itself, as you can see, instinctively, your hand will just naturally fall into this position. It's not going to be in the up-curled position as it would be up here. Your hand will not, biomechanically, your hands fall in line with your wrist. When your hand is raised, like so, up at this level, notice that my arm is already kind of bent. But when I lower my arm, I can't really comfortably keep my hand like this. Not as easily as I would up here. So having the blade oriented downwards like a tachi actually allows me to take full biomechanical advantage of how my arm would naturally align itself to grab something so low. Now, not to say that the Japanese way of doing it didn't work. It's just there are actual advantages to the sword frog that, unless you study both Kenjutsu and Hima like I do, they can kind of be overlooked or not looked into enough. And I hope this little demonstration has proved useful to you, my noble band of outlaws. If you have any ideas that I didn't cover or want to expand upon, leave it down in the comments below. Update on Outlaw Granny, she's doing fine, as I am to know she's being moved into the rehab center today to start her week-long rehab before she can come back home again. Hence why I'm in a much more better mood and have been pumping out content more, is because now I don't need to worry so much about Outlaw Granny. I know she's back on the mend again, and I can start focusing on putting more effort back into my videos. So, until next time, my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all, be crazy rednecks, be safe, use your weapons, and let me know what you think of the sword frog and katanas. Especially, here's one last thing I forgot to mention. A longer blade really benefits from this. Because if you look here, you really have to outstretch your arm and kind of take proper form. With a sword frog, on the other hand, I can stand in a perfectly straight position and pull this thing right out and have about a foot extra. If I took a proper stance, that immediately goes to about 1.5 to 2 foot extra of space between the entrance of my scabbard and the tip of the sword. Yeah, so with that in mind, I'm out. Peace. Let me know what you think in the comments below about the sword frog thing.